Welcome back, guys. This is part 3 of our Chapter 33 review. We're picking up with the election 1936, in which Alf Landon of Kansas is going to challenge FDR, the incumbent. And, well, let's just take a look at FDR's confidence first. He famously referred to his critics by saying, "I welcome their hatred." In other words, I think I can beat you, I know I can beat you, and I'm going to beat you. And you can look at the map. 1936 is an absolute FDR steamroller. This is clearly an endorsement of FDR's policies, the New Deal, all that stuff, and a rejection of Alf Landon and the Republicans. So a couple things. Why does FDR win and win so big? Well, this is further evidence of that so-called New Deal coalition, this alliance of different groups like labor unions, whites in the South who are now converting back to Democrat, at least temporarily. We're going to see, of course, African Americans we looked at earlier in this chapter voting Democratic. You put all that together and you have a coalition of voters who are just so large a number they can't really be defeated. And people who had not necessarily voted Democrat in the past do because of FDR. He seems like he cares about the forgotten man. And there are a lot of people who will go on to become lifelong Democrats because of FDR. They continue voting, Democratic decades after FDR's death. Now, that brings us up to a court packing plan, which is something, I don't remember if we got to this in class. I don't think we did, but here we go. And what happens with the court packing plan is FDR, frankly, is a little overconfident that this huge, stunning victory he got in 1936 means that he can kind of do whatever he pleases. And we see, there are some warning signs, though, prior to that election, that there are certain programs that the Supreme Court, in particular, is very wary of. And this is FDR's biggest obstacle. What do I do about this Supreme Court, this very conservative Supreme Court that's standing in my way? And he decides, well, we got to do something, with these old guys, these old conservative guys on the Supreme Court. And he wants the Supreme Court to jump in line with public opinion. If they have endorsed me overwhelmingly in 1936 and my policies, the Supreme Court shouldn't stand in the way of the other two branches who are marching forward with the New Deal. And so to accomplish this, he does something pretty dramatic. He asks Congress to grant him power to appoint new Supreme Court justices, one for each of the justices over 70 who wouldn't retire. And when you go back to the picture here, 6 out of the 9 justices were in fact over 70. So FDR wants the ability to basically kind of replace these people based on their ages. Now, I say replace, it's not technically a replacement. What he would do is basically add to the court new people. So it's not a replacement one for one, but it's packing the court with people who would be sympathetic to the New Deal. The problem with this plan is FDR really kind of drops this on Congress's lap without a lot of warning, and I guess he'd become kind of used to them just doing whatever he wants them to do. And Congress and the public itself reacts negatively to this. They see this as a clear grab for power, as someone who is breaking down the system of checks and balances, someone who's strangling the other branches of government and becoming potentially a dictator. You can see Supreme Court here. He's trying to cut this, right, to give him a dictatorship power. And in the end, this plan fails. Congress gives him a weaker bill, one that applies to lower courts, but not the Supreme Court. And FDR has really suffered his big, he suffered other setbacks before, but this is the first really telling sign that the New Deal has limits and that his political goodwill only goes so far. And frankly, he's kind of squandered that goodwill with his plan. So now let's wrap up by looking at the end of the New Deal and kind of look at its legacy as far as what happened. Notice he's pouring money down here and everything's leaking. This is, of course, the major criticism of the New Deal. It's just too expensive for the taxpayer. So some problems. Number one, unemployment, very, very high, even though billions had been spent on the New Deal. And this results in something called the Roosevelt Recession in 1937. And partly due to the fact that people are paying higher taxes now because of Social Security, and of course higher taxes you pay means less money you have to spend, which means that hurts business. And the government had also begun cutting back on some of their spending, and that means less money, less jobs for a lot of those programs. So you put all that stuff together, and the New Deal begins to kind of sputter and stall. And so FDR is really left with two choices: to cut back spending dramatically or spend more than ever. And he chooses the latter. Let's spend more than ever. And he basically follows the political philosophy of a guy named John Maynard Keynes, a very famous British economist who believed in something called planned deficit spending. And planned deficit spending simply means that in the bad times, like the Depression or a recession, the government spends lots and lots of money to get the economy going. And that's not a bad thing, he says, because when the economy turns around in the good times, you simply pay down that debt you've accrued through all that spending, and then the economy's back on track. So the bad times, spend a lot, and then pay down that debt when the good times return. And so FDR is going to embrace this and spend. Let's look at some major criticisms of the New Deal. And the first one is the most obvious. It's just it's too much money, right? It's too much waste, too much corruption. That this is putting America on the path to socialism and perhaps even some sort of Marxist future. That this is, there are hints of communism in the New Deal. As you can see from the cartoon, we've got things like redistribution of wealth. That's a socialist idea hiding behind the mask of the New Deal. This cartoon is reminding the administration that the taxpayers only have so much money, and they want you to start saving some of that money, but they respond with more and more spending. Another rather curious criticism of the New Deal was that some people said that simply there are too many Jews in the new administration. People called it, I think, a pretty sad joke these days, but they called it the Jew Deal. And this is something that really got under the skin of a lot of people, the idea that this is some sort of Jewish conspiracy to bring socialism, communism to America. There's also just the fact that FDR is trying things just so many things so quickly that this is not the stability business people like. They don't like this try anything spirit the FDR is bringing to the table. Another criticism is the fact that the government simply grew too large, and it definitely grew. The FDR administration grew the federal government tremendously during the New Deal, and of course once you build it up like that, it's hard to take those pieces away. The national debt is going to skyrocket, which is ironic because in 1932, FDR had run, and part of his platform was a balanced budget, something he will not do. And another criticism would be the fact that people in America became too reliant on the government, a reliance that's hard to break, almost impossible to break. I think the most important criticism, and the one that definitely has the most truth to it, is that the New Deal simply fails to end the Great Depression. So if the New Deal, if your measuring stick of success is ending the Depression, it doesn't do that. It doesn't deliver. Now you could argue that you shouldn't measure it that way, that you should look at the New Deal through through a different lens. But again, if that's your plan, then we have to end the Great Depression. The New Deal simply doesn't do that. Now we're going to look at FDR's defenders. So we've looked at the critics. Now let's look at some of the defenses of the New Deal. Number one, it's, we were talking about the 3 R's earlier: relief, recovery, reform. The relief part in particular is very, very important. This is giving people, the basic necessities to continue life. It's going to help relieve a lot of suffering. It's going to give people confidence back and some of their dignity back. And it's hard to quantify that with dollars, how important that really is. There's also the argument that it's impossible to prove, but it's one that's, a pretty attractive argument, that the Depression may have been far worse had there been no Great Deal. Again, you can't prove something that didn't happen, but it's certainly something FDR's defenders would say is this would have been way worse had we not done what we did. I think another interesting defense of the New Deal is if you look at across the world in the 1930s, you see dictatorships on the rise. You see just awful people like like Hitler, like Mussolini, like Stalin, just running amok. And while democracy seems to be kind of fading elsewhere in the globe, it's not here in America. That perhaps the New Deal helped save democracy from a Huey Long type from rising here in America. So that is just about it for chapter 33. A quick overview. Obviously, there's stuff we didn't cover, but that's the basic necessities where you need to remember the 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. I would definitely know a couple of the programs like the CCC, the NRA, and the WPA come to mind. I would know things about Eleanor Roosevelt. I would look at the political change that happens with African Americans shifting to the Democratic Party. These are all really, really important things. I would also hone in on the criticisms and the defenses of the New Deal, which we just covered. I could definitely see maybe a short answer question where you have to address the defense versus the criticism of the New Deal.